Hey everyone, I'm the Artful Spuddler and welcome back to my channel where I explain and demonstrate how I create contemporary batik paintings on cotton. I want to cover cracking this week, and it's probably worth starting with the origins of cracking in traditional batik. Let me begin by briefly explaining the origins of batik as a process and where the word batik came from. Batik as a method of creating arts and crafts has been used by humans all over the world for millennia. In ancient Egypt, artifacts were discovered that were created by this method. However, as far as the Western world is concerned, batik was first introduced to Europe via the Silk Road and the production of batik fabric in Indonesia by the villagers enslaved by the Western trading companies. So for some, this was the birth of batik, and that is true in one way. And that is that the word batik is Indonesian and was originally associated with a style of fabric produced solely in that area. Well, time's moved on since then, and we've become a far more connected world, and batik, well, the word, is now considered a general word for the method of creating images and art on natural fibres such as fabric, wood and paper, using a resist of some kind. Many in the batik community have their own very specific list of elements that need to be in a batik to make it, well, a batik. And a lot of these are rooted in the belief that batik is a style and method of dyeing that relates solely to the Indonesian batik style, which is protected by UNESCO. However, Indonesian batik is now just one style and process available for batik artists to be inspired by. With the invention of new materials and tools such as Procyon dyes and electric wax pens, and a greater awareness of the styles and symbolisms of other communities creating batik across the globe, the word batik now has a much broader definition, and contemporary batik painting was born out of this evolution. So why have I told you all this? Well, would it surprise you that cracking in traditional Indonesian batik was an absolute no-no? It was considered a defect, and the fabric created with cracking would be rejected as faulty or substandard. However, over time, and as the Western world began to embrace the technique of batik painting, cracking has become more popular. Okay, so with that said, let's get cracking, and I can show you some of the more interesting ways that this wonderful technique can be used in batik painting, fibre art and collage, and even scrapbooking. And I'm going to concentrate on cracking on cotton, but if you work on paper, all these techniques can be tried out using a thick rice paper or other organic paper product. First off, well, what is cracking? Wax, especially paraffin wax, is quite brittle, and if a piece of cloth covered with wax is crumpled or folded, if these cracks are not mended by adding more wax over the cracks or melting the wax into those cracks, then when the dye is added, it will seep into the cracks and dye the exposed fibres. When creating fabric for quilting and other fibre art, cracking is an amazing way to create texture. It also can be used to create wonderful and complex effects, but without that much skill. So to start with, I'm going to run through how to create textures on cotton with just a few ingredients and some Procyon dyes. Now, trying out batik for the first time can be quite daunting. All the equipment, the very different way of working, as well as an understanding of the way dyes work, can be a huge barrier for those who want to try out batik for the first time. And I do recommend that if you're interested in batik, that you find a beginner's class near to you. However, as batik is a little known art and craft, it can be difficult to find one. So I've designed this first demo so that you can try this at home with household items as well as the compulsory Procyon MX dyes. Let's start with a quick rundown of the materials that you'll need. So for this demo, I used my Procyon MX fibre reactive dyes, and I used the primaries plus the black, and these are readily available to buy as a dyeing starter kit, or maybe you already have them after trying ice dyeing, for instance. The primary colours are lemon yellow, turquoise and magenta, with black as the key. You can apply these dyes using a paintbrush or even a new washing up sponge, and you'll need some containers for your mixed up dyes. I tend to use old takeaway trays and tubs for this. So to fix your dyes to your fabric, you'll need to make up a chemical water. For this, you'll need some soda ash, which can easily be bought online, along with some urea if you have it, and you'll need a jug or jam jar for your chemical water to be mixed in. When it comes to wax, if you're trying this out for the first time, you will need a plain white household candle to melt and a metal container to hold the hot wax in. And yesterday we had tuna salad sandwiches for lunch, so I could use this shallow tin can for this demo. Then you'll need an oil burner. Again, these can be picked up online and are inexpensive, and you'll need a tea light to heat up your wax with. If you're using a wax burner, it will take a while for your wax to heat up in your tin can, but be patient because it'll get there. Just as a quick reminder, paraffin wax, if heated, gives off toxic vapour, and when heated too much, it will smoke. And so it's important to always have good ventilation when dealing with wax and never leave an open flame unattended. To apply the wax, you'll need an old paintbrush, and it needs to be made from natural fibres, as the plastic ones can melt if left in the wax for too long. For this experiment, you can use any sort of fabric made from natural fibres such as linen, cotton, hemp or even bamboo. But these dyes won't work well with synthetic fibres and won't work at all on silk. For this project, I'm working with a piece of lawn cotton which is around 9 inches or 24 centimetres square. But you can use whatever size fabric that you have handy. You will also need some newspaper and an old iron for the end of this project. And lastly, you'll probably need some rags or kitchen towels for mopping up the spills and just basically generally wiping down your surfaces with. And a bin liner or plastic tray would be very handy if you want to protect those surfaces. Okay, so let's get started. To begin, you'll need to mix up some chemical water. First off, you need hot water, but not boiling, hot enough to dissolve the chemicals, so hot tap water should be fine, or what I tend to use is a mixture of the hot water from the kettle and a little bit of cold water to bring it down in its temperature. I have a chemical water jug, which is used solely for this purpose, but any jug with a lid will do, and if you're trying this for the first time, you can use a jam jar. Before I add my water, I put 1 heaped teaspoon of soda ash and 2 tablespoons of urea into a jug, and then I add hot water to the jug and give it a good stir. When it comes to urea, you may need to add more depending on your climate and what you're producing, but for this demo you don't need much, and if you're a beginner you can try this without using urea if you wish. Once the chemical water is mixed and you've stirred it well and on a number of occasions, leave it to cool for a while, and when it's cool, it's time to turn your attention to your dyes. We will be using just the primaries for this part of the experiment, so you won't need to mix up a black at this time. To mix up the dyes, pour a little of the chemical water into each tub and then sprinkle a little of the dye in each and stir well. I tend to leave the dyes to settle for a few minutes and then stir each tub again, continuing this process until all the powder has been dissolved. Once this is done, I can start my demo, and to begin with I simply paint these primaries onto my fabric. Now normally I'd work off a frame, but if you don't have a frame, simply cover up a flat surface with a bin liner for instance, and although you may get a few lines appearing where the folds of the bin liner are, for this experiment these won't matter. Alternatively, you can use a plastic tray, and this works well for this experiment too. Painting on the dyes in lines, allowing them to blend organically on the cloth, really only takes a few minutes, and before I can start waxing, I need to leave this to cure and dry. As this is a demo, I will only be leaving my fabric to cure for 4 or 5 hours, but if you're intending to use this finished fabric in a formal artwork or in quilting, you will need to let your fabric cure for at least 24 hours in a warm place, with cling film covering it to prevent it from drying out too quickly. And if you're creating fabric for a purpose such as quilting, you will need to add urea to your chemical water and leave your fabric to cure for ideally a couple of days. Once the cloth has been washed in cold water to remove any excess dye and then left to dry in a warm place, it's ready for waxing. Before you apply any wax, it's vital to make sure that your cloth is totally dry. You can test this by running the back of your hand over the cloth, and if it feels cold, it needs to dry some more. I always run a hairdryer over my cloth just before I wax, just to make sure it's totally dry, as I live in a humid environment surrounded by trees, and you'd be surprised how damp fabric can become if left in my studio overnight. For this demonstration I'm using paraffin wax only, although later in the video I'll show you the impact of adding beeswax has on cracking. So all I'm going to do is paint on my hot wax, covering the entire cloth. The wax needs to be quite hot and the layer mustn't be too thick, as this will impact on the cracking, and conversely, if the wax is too thin, it'll break away when cracked and leave large areas of bare cloth. If you spend a little time experimenting, you'll soon be able to find the right thickness for your fabric choice and the wax mix that you're using, and I'll be running through cracking with different wax mixes a little later in this video. It's far easier to wax fabric on a frame, as it really needs to be off the surface for the wax to melt into the cloth properly. But if you don't have an old wooden picture frame handy or an embroidery hoop, then you can wax on a flat surface. However, you will need to add a towel below your fabric, as you don't want the coolness of your surface to cool down your wax too quickly, and you also need to perhaps raise your fabric off the towel when beginning your wax line to make sure that it doesn't stick to the towel and you end up having to do this. Now, I've actually created 3 identical pieces of cloth so that I can show you the impact freezing has on wax, as well as 2 different ways to add dyes to your cloth and hopefully achieve an interesting result. So here are 2 of the samples, and they've been scrunched to a similar size. Then I simply carefully unfold each of the pieces, and if you're using paper you need to be very careful. And then I've just popped these on a plastic tray ready for dyeing. Now the one on the left was treated to an hour in the freezer before cracking, and the one on the right was cracked at room temperature, which here today is 17 degrees Celsius or 62 degrees Fahrenheit. If you take a look at them, the cracking on each is very similar, but let's see how well the dye is picked up in the next stage. Okay, so the next step is to add more dye, and for the first of these pieces of fabric, the piece that was cracked at room temperature, you will now need to mix up a strong black dye, and we're about to create cracking in what is considered the traditional style. Now normally I would use a frame to apply the dyes and then the wax, and only remove my fabric from the frame to crack it. I would then put it back on my frame and continue with my process. However, there are other ways that you can dye your cloth, and the first one is by simply brushing it on. So for this one I've just popped a sheet of perspex from an old picture frame on the surface to work on. Take a little time ensuring that dye is introduced to the cracks, and you can use a brush to move loose wax flakes away. Another way to add the colour is with a sponge. But make sure you put on some rubber gloves or you'll end up with dyed hands for days to come. And just a note, I'm prone to forget of using my gloves, and you'll come to see this often over time. But trust me, if you remember, please pop on some gloves. Anyway, with the second piece of cloth, I used an old plastic tray this time, and I used turquoise solution to add colour to the cracks. I used a large brush and made sure that the whole cloth had been exposed to this new dye. As with the last piece, I flipped the fabric over and painted the other side in the same way. And with the final piece of fabric, I began by adding some simple folds to the top like spokes of a wheel, and then made some horizontal folds at the bottom, working up. After that, I painted on yellow and magenta and blended them on the cloth. All that was left to do was to leave this overnight to cure and dry, and after that I washed each piece in cold water to remove the excess dye. I left them to dry naturally in our warm kitchen, and then it was time for the next stage. I'm now only going to work on one piece, as the other pieces are now done and ready to be ironed off. But with this piece of cloth, I'm going to show you how you can add a second colour to your fabric. Before you add any further cracking, you need to decide if you want to keep your existing cracks and simply add a second colour to the cracks, perhaps the colour you put on first was wrong, or that you want to remelt the wax and make a whole new set of marks. There are 2 ways to remelt the wax. One way is to use a hairdryer on a high heat setting, move it over the surface and watch the wax begin to melt slightly. And as it melts, it'll mend those fractures. Now this works reasonably well, but you will need to add a quick layer of wax over the top, and ideally add this wax whilst the existing wax is still warm, and the 2 layers of wax can become one. If I want to remove cracks but keep others, I heat up a screwdriver and the handles of various sized spoons on my stove. Most of the time the spoons don't actually get that hot, not at the end that you're holding, but do be careful and make sure that you use a cloth or some gloves because they will eventually heat up quite a lot. I heat up the surface of my wax where I want the cracks to be mended until it begins to melt, and then I pop a second layer of wax over the top. There are other ways that you can melt your wax, and I will do a separate video about that. Once you're happy with the cracks that you've sealed and re-waxed over, you need to leave the whole thing to cool down, and then you can fold or crack it in any way that you like. But with this piece of cloth, I'm going to show you how you can build up colours on your fabric using only cracking. So I repeated the last process that I did on this piece of cloth. I re-waxed the fabric and then added some more folds once the wax was cold. Then I popped it onto my plastic tray and painted both sides with turquoise. Left it to cure, and then I gave it a rinse and hung it up to dry. Then it was time to iron off all my 3 samples and see what the results were. Now this looks great, although I personally would prefer less harsh cracks and maybe a few more subtle ones. But the black cracking really does bring the colours of the fabric to life. Now sample 1 was cracked at room temperature, whereas sample 2 was put in the freezer for half an hour before it was cracked. You can see that the colder temperature made the wax far more rigid and the cracks are larger, but there are less of them. The use of turquoise as the colour for the cracks means that it is in fact a number of colours that have been overlaid on the existing colour, say the magenta, and that's created a purple on the cloth. And where the fabric was already yellow, a strong green was created. Now, when using colour for cracking, it is important to bear in mind the basic rule about avoiding muddy colours, and that is to work within no more than 2 colour families and avoid painting all 3 colours onto the same area. And of course, for more subtle cracking, you can limit your palette to a 1 colour family only. So finally, let me show you the 3rd sample and let's see how the cracking in 2 separate colours has worked. You can see that by using more than 1 colour and blending other colours into the cracks on the cloth, the cracking is a lot less obvious and appears more a part of the overall effect, not just an add-on at the end of a project. I think you can see how this can be used to add interest and texture to fabric, and how if you are skilled in cracking, you could almost create a landscape with this technique. But if you're doing multiple layers of cracking in colour, watch out for those muddy colours and make sure your fabric doesn't end up too dark. Now, I love cracking, but in contemporary batik painting, I believe that it should be used sparingly. It isn't a mandatory requirement of batik painting, and unless cracking is part of your signature style, try to use it sparingly and intelligently. If you want to explore cracking, one thing you do need to consider is what sort of wax mix you use, because each wax mix, its proportion of beeswax to paraffin wax, for instance, will result in slightly different cracks. So yes, you guessed it, it's time for another demo. Now, different waxes will give you different results when it comes to cracking, and before I begin, it's worth explaining the differences between paraffin and beeswax, as these are the 2 ingredients I'll be using for this demo. Although I have added a little soya to this demo, just so you can see why soya wax really doesn't work when creating these wonderful organic marks. Paraffin wax is a great wax for batik, and when I first began to batik, I used to melt household candles for my wax. Now, paraffin wax is cheap to buy and it's readily available, however it is brittle and cracks easily. I add beeswax to my paraffin wax when batik painting, as it adds flexibility to the wax's surface, which prevents accidental cracking, and of course it's eco-friendly but an awful lot more expensive to buy. So normally I'll work with a wax mix which is around 70-30, with a split in favour of paraffin wax, and pre-mixed batik wax pellets tend to be a mixture with a similar ratio. With regards to cracking, the ratio of these 2 waxes in a batik wax is critical. You see, the more paraffin wax in the mix, the more cracks that will be created, and I thought that it was worth actually showing you the impact this ratio has on cracking. So I drew up a simple set of shapes, and in separate metal containers I measured out a combination of paraffin to beeswax, using a different wax mix, trying to keep the thickness as even as possible. I then removed the cloth from the frame And then in a bowl I mixed up a blue, which I made from some leftover magenta and turquoise dyes. Then I scrunched up the fabric and added it to the bowl. If I was a real vat dyer, I'd have a much bigger bowl and setup, but as I rarely vat dye, this bowl will have to do. I left this for about 10 minutes and then removed the fabric, straightened it out and then scrunched it again. Then I put it back into the bowl and agitated it a little. I repeated this process a number of times. I left it to do its thing for the rest of the day and then I washed away the excess dye and hung it up to dry overnight. So once the fabric was dry, I just ironed off the wax and we can now see the results. The pure paraffin has resulted in a lot more cracks and the variety of cracks is the greatest. But with that also comes the sludge that wax erosion causes. And all of this has noticeably darkened the L shape, which is why fabric cracked with pure paraffin wax can be a lot darker than with other wax mixes. If you look at the soya wax, you can see that it really didn't do anything other than deteriorate, and this resulted in a very dark, slightly textured rectangle, which is great, but not what you could call cracking. Personally, I prefer the 3 parts paraffin to 2 parts beeswax mix. The cracks are well defined, but there aren't too many cracks, so it isn't likely to mess up the tonal values too much. The 2 parts paraffin to 3 parts beeswax mix just hasn't got enough of the fine cracks to make it that interesting to me. The 9 parts paraffin to 4 parts beeswax mix, which was a pre-bought Batik mix, just hasn't resulted in enough finer, more interesting cracks for my liking. But obviously everyone is different, and so hopefully this test has given you an idea of what ratios you might want to work with. And of course you could always use different mixes in one batik and see how that looked. Well, hopefully this experiment has given you an idea of how the proportions that you choose for your paraffin to beeswax mix can have on the look of your cracking, and that this video has provided you with enough information to begin to try this at home, whether it be on fabric or on paper. So to end this video, I thought that I'd show you a batik that I just created specifically to show you how I use cracking in my work. I may create a short to show exactly how this was created, but as this video is already pretty long, I will just say that when it comes to trees, and especially winter trees, cracking is a really good technique to use, and I added just a suggestion of texture to the foreground of this batik just to help to unite the image. You'll also notice that this is actually a very muted piece of work when it comes to colour, and in a later video I'll be running through how to see colour, and I'll run through some basic artist's exercises to help to see greys as more than just a mixture of black and white. Well, that brings me to the end of this video about cracking, and hopefully I've inspired a few of you to try this out for yourselves at home. Whether you're using fabric or paper, the options really are only as limited as your imagination. As a quick update on the ice dyeing, I am still trying things out, and leaving the fabric for a couple of days in a warm place covered with cling film has improved my results, but I still haven't found that magic recipe yet. Although I have been advised to try pickling salt, so when I've tried this out, I'll be able to report back some more. I am also going to explore bubble dyeing, which looks really exciting. So please remember to subscribe and hit the bell, and when I drop that particular video, you'll know when it's there. Anyway, on that note, I'll say goodbye, and remember that whatever you do today, just make it creative.